All right. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all our speakers and our viewers joining us online. My name is Russell Shao. I am the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed policy discussion about Taiwan. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a biweekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, where we feature timely analysis and informed opinions about Taiwan. We also organize regular public seminars, like the virtual seminar that you are participating in today, where we invite expert commentators and informed influencers on policy issues related to Taiwan. We also organize an annual symposium, usually in the fall, where we invite leading policymakers and scholars and thinkers about U.S.-Taiwan relations to really discuss the past, present, and future of this critical bilateral relationship. In addition to these policy research and events, we also provide scholarships for scholars as well as young academics and creative thinkers who are interested to perform short-term field research in Taiwan. This opportunity also affords Taiwanese researchers as well to come to the United States for short-term field research. In addition to these programs, we also have regular cultural programs. So stay tuned for some events that we will have later this year, featuring films from Taiwan. Of course, I would be remiss if we began today's program if I did not thank our co-founders, our board members, our advisors, and the staff and interns that make all our programs possible. If you're not already subscribed to receive all our updates, you may do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. So let's start today's program. Amid the novel coronavirus pandemic, the world order is experiencing unprecedented disruption. The transatlantic relationship between the United States and Europe has been a vital foundation of an international system built after World War II and the Cold War that is coming increasingly under strain due to the rise of authoritarian revisionist powers and increasing strategic competition between two vastly different systems. Indeed, CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping sees a struggle between the Chinese and Western systems. General Secretary Xi has made this point abundantly clear in his very first speech to the CCP Politburo in January 2013, where he states, "Most importantly, we must concentrate our efforts on building a socialism that is superior to capitalism and laying the foundation for a future where we will win the initiative and have the dominant position." Despite a broad and deeply shared commitment to human rights and democratic values, as well as interest in maintaining the rules-based world order, the United States and Europe have been unable to translate overlapping policy goals to collaborate effectively on foreign policy initiatives. This is happening against a backdrop of an increasingly aggressive People's Republic of China, both regionally and globally, as clearly exhibited by Beijing's heavy-handed approach to the Hong Kong protests, its military activities in the South China Sea and East China Sea, debt trap financing, and its so-called wolf warrior diplomacy worldwide. The most recent U.S. national security strategy released in 2017 clearly recognizes these challenges and underscores a return to great power competition between the United States and China. For its part, Europe appears to be taking a harder look at China. The European Commission, in its EU-China A Strategic Outlook, labeled China a systemic rival. And senior EU diplomats have accused China of waging a pandemic disinformation campaign. For Taiwan, Beijing's aggression has always been an existential matter. In the last 4 years, China has significantly ramped up its multifaceted pressure campaign on Taipei in an effort to coerce the democratically elected leaders to bow to Beijing's demands for cross-strait negotiations. Taipei's success in handling COVID-19, in which the original epicenter was in Wuhan, in China, have helped to highlight the successes of a democratic model in the face of China's authoritarian model. And by extension, this democratic model is also the free and open model that forms the foundation of the existing rule-based system. In a way, the preservation of Taiwan's democracy and freedom is part and parcel of the preservation of the existing order. If the United States and Europe are to effectively safeguard Taiwan's de facto independence and freedom, and maintaining the rules-based order, overcoming their differences and moving toward a truly transatlantic approach to cross-strait relations should be necessary. This timely virtual seminar will examine the opportunities as well as the challenges for such an approach, incorporating voices from the United States, Europe, and Taiwan for really GTI's most global discussion to date. The timeliness of our discussion is only surpassed by the fact that as we speak now, the US National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien and Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger are in Europe for a three-day trip to meet with European officials on China. The countries on the itinerary reportedly include the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy. Hopefully they or their staff will hear some of our discussions here today to help inform their discussions. And to provide insights on all these issues and more, we have truly an excellent panel of experts, and whom I will briefly introduce here. First, we have Robert Wong, who is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Robert was a career Foreign Service officer in the US Department of State, and he served as senior US official for APEC, as well as the deputy chief of mission at the US Embassy in Beijing, as well as the deputy director of the American Institute in Taiwan. Next, we have Ambassador Michael Rowley, who is a former career diplomat with over 30 years experience, principally handling UK policy towards East and Southeast Asia. Ambassador Rowley's final Foreign and Commonwealth Office appointment was as director of the British Trade and Cultural Office in Taipei, who is essentially the de facto British ambassador to Taiwan. And upon leaving Taiwan, he joined BAE Systems, initially as director, Far East, responsible for strategic advice on the company's business development. Next, we have Teresa Fallon, who is the founder and the director of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies in Brussels. She's concurrently a member of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific, a non-resident senior fellow of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, an adjunct professor at the George Marshall European Center for Security Studies, and a member of the CEPS Task Force on AI and Cybersecurity. Last but not least, we have Dr. Lai Yizhong, who is the president of the Prospect Foundation, a Taiwan-based think tank. Prior to joining the Prospect Foundation, he held several prominent positions within the Democratic Progressive Party, serving as executive director of the DPP mission to the United States and as director general of the Department of International Affairs. He has also worked as special assistant with the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in Tokyo. I'll just add at this point right now that, that both Michael and Bob are advisors to GTI. Now, the panelists will provide opening comments for about 10 minutes each. Following everyone's comments, I will facilitate discussion by posing a few questions to all our speakers. And then we'll close around 15 minutes at the end of the session for audience Q&A. Audience members may present your questions by either using the chat function on YouTube or by sending an email to contact@globaltaiwan.org. Please remember to include your name as well as your affiliation when asking your questions. Without further ado then, let me turn the floor over to Robert Wong, who will provide us with his US perspective on transatlantic approach to cross-strait relations. Over to you, Bob.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Russell. And also just want to say I'll make my comments short and brief, but I just want to say hi to all my good friends there. And of course, first time to see Teresa. You all virtually. Let me make it fairly short. I think Russell has already talked about why I think this might be a good time for transatlantic cooperation in terms of responding to China. Russell went through the list of what China has been doing over the last decade, the last 4 or 5 years, as well as what it's done, I think, during the coronavirus pandemic around the world, being more globally sort of challenging in terms of its disinformation campaign in Europe. So what China has essentially done really is over the last 10 years, and again, in particular, the last 4 or 5 years, is really to raise the awareness of the world about what China's challenge means to the world. Before that, you had Deng Xiaoping's hide and hide, but now it's very clear. So I think the U.S. perhaps came to this understanding a little bit earlier, but clearly, based on what Russell said, I think Michael and Teresa and others will talk about this recognition of China's, and let me put it very bluntly, threat and potential threat to the interests, the economic interests, especially in the technology sector, but also to the values of the post-war global rules-based economic order and liberal order. So I think the fact that more people are awakening to this challenge means that I think it's time now for a transatlantic response, a more coherent and cohesive response to China, and additionally to cross-strait relations. Because at the same time, not only is there more recognition of what China stands for, what the challenge is. When I say China, by the way, I mean the Communist Party regime in China, not Chinese as a whole. Just I want to make that very clear. But at the same time, what has happened is that I think it has also highlighted Taiwan's position in Asia, Taiwan's vibrant democracy in the recent election, Taiwan's, I think, strong and capable handling of the coronavirus pandemic, Taiwan's economic technology position in the global regional supply chain, and many other things. And so I think it's done that, and I think this therefore is is the right time, the right opportunity to try to put together a response to China and on cross-strait relations. And now having said that, I think at the same time, I think we're all aware of the challenges. The first challenge, obviously, is transatlantic relations, which hasn't been great under the Trump administration, especially given his focus on investment issues with Europe, his position on NATO, and so on and so forth. So in any case, we've had a lot of problems. So I'm really happy to see the fact that we're now sending people. Pompeo, of course, has been there. Secretary of State Pompeo has been to Europe several times. Now, I think pushing harder to try to get a more cohesive response with our European friends. But beyond that, I think Russell pointed out earlier, there are also many different European countries. I mean, there are 27 EU members, all with their different national interests. A lot of them have very strong economic ties or dependence on China. And so you're not going to be able to get a very cohesive, I think, response with everybody, all 27 EU members, with the United States, and even the US, there are different opinions on this. And so you're not going to be able to get a very strong, cohesive response in a very formal sense. So to cut to the chase, I think what I would propose essentially is that, and again, my views are not a US view, to make it very clear, it's just my own views sitting here in the US, but they are my own views. And my own view is basically that we should try to simply increase coordination, as I and Matt Pottinger, simply increase coordination with our European friends, whichever countries, our like-minded countries, like-minded governments, to try to see if we can somehow get our policies in sync. Again, doesn't have to be a formal alliance, doesn't have to be a coalition, doesn't have to involve all EU members, but just to sort of coordinate with each other on what we're doing individually, separately, and hopefully then get a more coherent response, I think, to the challenge from China and on cross-strait relations. So in this area, then, make it very quick, I have some ideas. For example, initially, I think, as I think most of you know, we've had several legislation passed in Congress urging the president to do different things. These include Taiwan Travel Act in 2018, Asia Reassurance Act, Initiative Act, and most recently, of course, the Taipei Act, the Taiwan Alliance International Protection Enhancement Initiative. Before I got on this, but so we've had several acts that are encouraging, for example, to begin with, I think more high-level visits from the U.S. Executive branch and others to Taiwan, and I think that's a great idea. I think that we ought to. I think the executive, the White House, needs to start acting on it at the cabinet level, if possible. And of course, on the European side, I'll leave it to Teresa to discuss more. But we also have there at this point, I think in June, the formation of a what is it called? The International Parliamentary Alliance on China, that not only includes European members, but also Japan and Australia. And the idea then is to somehow put things together and with all of us, I think, try to increase our contact and expand our relationship with Taiwan. And of course, if possible, we want to make sure that we have something substantive beyond the symbolic nature of it, beyond the fact that we're to squeeze Taiwan international space. This itself will be important. But beyond that, I think if we could include some substantive content. And one thing that jumps to mind right away, of course, would be perhaps cooperation on public health, especially in wake of the coronavirus pandemic, how Taiwan has handled it, how it's been kept out of WHO. And I think the US and I think hopefully Europe and others will also be able to try to expand cooperation with Taiwan in this area in a substantive way, with visits to Taiwan, establishing offices. Perhaps I would suggest we establish, for example, a CDC office at AIT as an example only, so that we can prepare in our own interest for the next pandemic that might again start in China. And I think working with Taiwan in this area would be of benefit to both Europe and the United States. And finally, I think in terms of what's happened recently, I think there's more recognition that there needs to be more diversification of the global regional supply chain in Asia in particular, and Taiwan plays a critical role. Now, I'm not talking here about decoupling. I'm just talking here about diversifying it so that we don't have to be subjected to the leverage that China oftentimes uses against both European countries and the United States. And finally, just one last thing. I know the time is running out. I've explored this with Lai Yudrong before, and I think in the non-governmental sector, I think it would be very useful for Europe and the United States, being very strong on NGOs, civil society, democracy, to really try to get our NGOs to work more closely, and then move from that to perhaps use Taiwan as a way to promote democracy and civil society in Asia as a whole. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob. I think you made some excellent points in your presentation. I think the one on the need for increased coordination between the United States and European country is absolutely critical. But of course, that is where a lot of the challenges also lies: is how do you increase coordination with such a diverse body and with varying interests, as you noted. I think the point, especially I think I would just like to highlight, the point about for more high level visits is very well I think taken. I mean, I think the United States and various European capitals can, I think, coordinate and better coordinate on that without really, without there being, I think, really divergent and substantive differences on the need for that, and that could be done, I think, quickly, and that would, I think, help to really, I think, underscore, I think, the support of the free and democratic community for what Taiwan has done, during the in response to the corona pandemic, and this sort of and now there seems to be this some sense in the international community of acknowledgement or recognition of a China model for their sort of ruthless sort of handling of the response, and there is this competition of the model, and I think Taiwan stands at a very great contrast to that model that I think the international community can help support by again doing more high level visits to Taiwan. Okay, next, let's turn the floor over to Michael Riley, who will provide us with a UK perspective on transatlantic approach to cross-strait relation. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Russell, and good day, everybody. Greetings to friends, former colleagues, and those listening in. If I'm going to be really brief, I would say that I've heard nothing yet with which I would disagree at all. If we're going to have a transatlantic approach, I think that this is probably the best time in the last 70 years to work for it, for at least three reasons. I mean, attitudes in Europe are probably now, I would say, towards China, are probably at the lowest level since the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, if indeed not earlier. But the reasons for the changes in attitude will be familiar. Growing recognition that far from this sort of ideal that was nurturing the West for 40 odd years, that China will gradually converge, there's this awareness that at least under Xi Jinping, China is increasingly a threat. As you said, the European Union has now branded it a systemic rival. Secondly, until now, Europe has been able to take what I might call a middle of the road position. It's wanted to avoid having to take sides between the USA and China, and it's not alone in that. China's neighbors have been similar. But under the current US administration, it's under more and more pressure to take sides on China. And if it's forced to choose, I don't think there's any doubt which side Europe's going to take. The transatlantic relationship is a bedrock of European security. We share values with the US, human rights, dignity, the rule of law that we don't share with China, and even our long-term interests fundamentally lie across the Atlantic. And the third factor, as Russell said in your introduction, recent Chinese behavior, the way they have misused the pandemic to try to make fairly crass propaganda has actually been counterproductive. A lot of the protective equipment that they donated to Europe was found to be unsuitable. Other stuff was sold at inflated prices. A constructive letter from EU ambassadors in Beijing suggesting cooperation was crudely censored by the China Daily because it mentioned the origins of the pandemic in Wuhan. So we've had the UK Foreign Secretary saying there can be no return to business as usual. And that was the general situation before China then imposed the national security law on Hong Kong. And I think, at least in the UK, but for a lot of people in Europe more generally, in many ways that's been not quite the final straw, but it's been the real game changer on top of everything else. China has now been seen to just casually ignore an international treaty that it had freely signed up to. So the potential for cooperation ought to be significant, but the challenges are at least as significant. The first one is that from Taiwan's perspective, these opportunities, if you like, are all basically negatives. They're reasons to be tough on China. None of them are positive reasons for Europe to be more supportive of Taiwan, which still struggles to get onto the radar screens here. As a very recent example, Taiwan's not on the EU's list of COVID-related safe travel destinations, even though we know that its handling of the pandemic has been exemplary. Its incidence rate has been one of the lowest anywhere. Secondly, the initiative for a strategic new coordinated transatlantic approach realistically would have to come from the USA. That's the reality of 70 years of American leadership of the free world, its leadership of NATO, its security role in East Asia. Even under an internationalist president, that would require a major effort. But under the current one, as Bob has just said, transatlantic relations are not good. So it's good that there are now people here in Europe. Pompeo was in London earlier in the year. There is a dialogue going on, but if you actually want to get something more strategic and coordinated, it needs more than that. A third challenge is that the EU doesn't, if you like, do hard security. That's the remit of NATO, the Western European Union. So there could be no question of an EU-US security approach. On the other hand, the EU is a major player in international trade agreements. But again, we see the Trump administration seems not to like multilateral trade agreements. It prefers bilateral ones. If we put all that to one side, the UK might be expected to be seen as a European country most likely to respond positively if there was to be a US initiative. Trump makes no secret or has said publicly he admires Johnson. It's reciprocated. The UK is no longer in the EU. British politicians regularly talk up the special relationship with the USA. But a note of caution that on China, the UK has actually got a long history of pursuing its own interests. And to give just two recent examples, under the Obama administration, it ignored American opposition in its desire to be the first Western country to join China's Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. More recently, at the start of this year, it ignored US lobbying and specifically allowed the use of Huawei equipment in its 5G program, although as of today, that position has changed and it's going to be phased out. Which leads me on to the question of Brexit, because there have been some observers here, mainly Conservative MPs, who have suggested that Brexit will offer or could offer opportunities to develop UK-Taiwan relations. Sadly, perhaps, I think that's actually unlikely. Firstly, because in the past, whenever the UK has been worried about developments in Hong Kong, it's tended to become even more cautious about its engagement with Taiwan for fear that that will just create another unnecessary irritant in its relations with China. Now, the situation is a bit different. Hong Kong is now part of China, but the UK, if not China, is still conscious of its obligations under the joint declaration. It's possible that this time things will be different, but I think it's too early to tell, and I would therefore inject a note of caution. Secondly, the previous UK government, but the same political persuasion, had made clear that a post-Brexit priority for the UK would be trying to get a free trade agreement with China. I think that's likely to change in the current circumstances, but not to the extent that I think a UK government would be willing to contemplate a trade agreement with Taiwan. It'll want to keep the door open to China in the hope that relations improve. And even if it doesn't, realistically, there are 16 odd countries with whom we do more trade than with Taiwan. They will be the priorities, and there's just limited negotiating capacity. So it'll be some years before we get to that. Having said all that, undoubtedly, we do need badly a coordinated strategic approach to Cross-Straits. But because there are so many other pressing issues, pandemic, Brexit for the UK, other things, I think getting that in the near future is unlikely. But nonetheless, and this is following on from what Bob said, there are still practical steps that I think could be taken that would make a difference. I said the EU is not involved in security matters, but on the other hand, both France and the UK have increased freedom of navigation passages through the South China Sea in the last 2 or 3 years. If there was to be a more formal transatlantic approach on those, it would be modest, but it would still send a very clear signal. And related to that, it's widely expected here that later in the year, the UK government will announce an increased security presence in East Asia. It's likely to be token rather than substantive, a small deployment of Marines, something like that. But it's still an opportunity to present a coordinated approach. The big question about it for now is whether it will be sustained, because actually just doing this runs completely counter to the UK's defence policy for the last 50 years, which has been to, it's called, withdraw from east of Suez. So the more that this new deployment and these new activities can be coordinated with the US, with France, and with others too, Japan, Australia, so that we have joint exercises, joint training, multinational freedom of movement, freedom of navigation operations, then I think the greater the long-term commitment will be and the greater the impact. Although hard security is important for Taiwan, so too is trade. And I think the West could be doing a lot more to encourage more trade with Taiwan as a way of supporting it. The EU's been talking about a bilateral investment agreement with Taiwan now for about 5 years. There has been some low-key progress. There are several specialist working groups. There have been lots of technical studies. But progress on a formal agreement has been zero. The obstacle's purely political. Until now, the EU's made it clear that it's not willing to sign an agreement with Taiwan before it's done so with China, and progress on that remains glacial. There's no reason why the EU couldn't move if it so wished to, and if it did in current circumstances, it would send a very clear signal to China. But Bob talked about the difficulty of coordination, and getting consensus among the 27 EU states on this would be highly unlikely. But if we look at trade more broadly, there's a striking disconnect between what Western countries say in terms of supporting Taiwan and what they're actually doing, particularly in terms of market access. And this isn't just the EU. The USA, for example, continues to insist that Taiwan should open its market to ractopamine treated pork before it will discuss any of the trade matters. Japan refuses to talk about Taiwan's wish to join the new Trans-Pacific Agreement until Taiwan first lifts its ban on agricultural imports from Fukushima. So while I suspect that a joint approach towards a new multilateral trade agreement with Taiwan is too ambitious for now, perhaps the USA, Japan, the EU, other like-minded countries could each pledge to take specific market access steps with Taiwan as a way of boosting its confidence. But I'll end with a final thought, which comes from the former head of our intelligence service, a former senior diplomat, who earlier this month said that the best way of helping create a new common front against China would be new leadership in the USA. I'll leave it there for now.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Rowley, for that, I think, very consummate sort of and comprehensive diplomatic remarks that I think really included a lot of good observations and fast and very interesting points there that you made, and treating a very complex topic like parsing out European perspectives on Taiwan and China in a manner that I think really helps to narrow our focus a bit on really the importance of trade and the challenges of trying to come to a more cohesive and coherent response, as Bob had alluded to. I think your point about really about even how close of an ally that of UK is to the US, how still it is difficult and there are divergent interests there, where the governments will take on different positions on issues that seemingly would there should be a common position on. Because again, there are different interests there, and so this as we are trying to work towards, and I think we all probably agree that we need to work towards a more of a transatlantic approach to these cross-strait issues. We do need to take a step-by-step approach and really work on what is, and really identifying first. I think what you've done beautifully is identifying what those steps could be. What are some of the low-hanging fruits? What should be some of the low-hanging fruits that we can take to really build a more of a habit of cooperation on cross-strait issues, and I sincerely hope that we can really continue this conversation, and that policymakers in both the U.S. and Europe and Taipei are listening in on this too, so that we can take measurable and measure steps to increase coordination on this very critical sets of issues here. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Teresa, who has the very difficult task of trying to summarize the European perspectives on cross-strait relations. So over to you, Teresa.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted and honored to be here with this esteemed group of commentators. I have to start with an apology because my computer seemed to have lost the bandwidth and I accidentally signed out, so I missed the first comments, but I'm glad everything's working now. I was given 3 questions to cover, and I'm not sure if he said this in the opening remarks, but just to reiterate that April 2019, the EU came up with a white paper just prior to the EU-China summit, where they encapsulated the EU position on China as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. And of course, the Chinese embassy spent about 2 or 3 days trying to parse out what systemic rival meant because they weren't really clear before they could actually respond. So that one sentence, those 3 descriptions, really shows how complex the EU relationship is. So we just had the EU-China summit that was done virtually. It was postponed and it was just done about a week and a half ago. And the outcome of that was that there was no joint statement. There wasn't even a joint press conference. So if you take it as a barometer of current relations of EU-China, it's not very good. For example, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, stated during the press conference, she called out Beijing on the cyber attacks on hospitals across Europe. So this was a big surprise to everybody. So that was probably the biggest takeaway from this event. Rather than the actual meat and potatoes of the summit, it was actually what was reported in the press conference. And if you read the press statement from the Chinese side and the EU side, you would think they were on a different planet, that they completely had 2 different events. And the key ask of the Europeans was the long-suffering Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the CAI. And this has been going on for 7 years. They've had 29 meetings. Last year, they were able to sign a joint communique because it was at the same time that the US was having a trade negotiation with China. China wanted to show that they had other friends. And so the previous 2 years, 2017, 2018, EU-China could not have a joint statement. They were unable to sign or make any agreements. So last year was a really watershed year, at least that was the perception here in Brussels. They managed to sign a joint agreement, and that the CAI, there would be specific progress made on that. So you can imagine everyone's surprise and in Brussels when absolutely no progress was made. Now, we know at the MPC back in Beijing, there was discussion about RCEP and also the CPTPP, 2 regional economic agreements in Asia Pacific. So you can see that for Beijing, the focus for trade agreements is really in their own region, whereas the EU trade agreements pretty much on the back burner. So China has everything that they want in Europe. Europe is open and it's easy for China, in the past they came and invested here. Since then, since there's no progress being made, the EU has actually brought defense instruments. So they're becoming far more defensive, and an FDI, a foreign direct investment screening mechanism, has been put in place. Strangely, only half of the EU member states had some form of a screening mechanism, so this is actually progress, but nevertheless, it was watered down. It's a bit toothless and there's not an enforcement mechanism, but that does not prevent other EU member states from coming up with their own or tightening their own investment agreements. For example, Germany, one of the biggest economies and biggest trade partners of China, is fearful in a post-COVID-19 economic landscape that a lot of these companies will become, sale of the century. So they've created a fund to help protect their high-tech industries from buyers or purchasers from China. So each member state, it's up to them how they can protect their economy as well. And the EU, the Commission has laid out some guidelines. So it's up to each individual member state to follow them and strengthen their own individual defense instruments. So it's becoming more difficult for China to invest in Europe, but it's one of the takeaways from this EU-China summit was that Beijing does not want to see export controls put on high tech. So this is the US, of course, expects the EU to cooperate with them on this. And when we had the honeymoon period of EU-China relations way back in 2003, after the Iraq War, where they were made a special comprehensive partner, one of the two asks that Beijing had was to lift the arms embargo and also to
it appears that we may have lost Teresa due to the bandwidth issue. We're going to try to get her to sign back in, and when she does, we'll let her finish her presentation. I think just to keep the train moving here, I'd like to turn it over to Lai Yizhong to give us his perspectives on providing a Taiwanese perspective on transatlantic cooperation over cross-strait issues. Yizhong, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Russell, and thanks for inviting me to this very distinguished panel and in this very interesting time for this very important topics. I think when we talk about the cross-strait relationship and the cross-strait relation management, in the past, generally the paradigm is always through the U.S.-China-Taiwan relationship. And then in the past 10 to 15 years, we started to expand to U.S.-Japan alliances versus Taiwan-China in the cross-strait scenarios. And I don't know whether the current development will lead us to more of the discussion through the Quad in the cross-strait relationship. But I think that probably is we saw some of the direction probably will lead to that. But when we talk about the U.S. and the European relation on the cross-straits, the so-called EU-US Taiwan-China relationship, it does not seem to be that is actually there, or basically in terms of the security sphere, the EU-China, EU-US and China, that is probably not on the radar on the cross-strait when we talk about cross-strait relationship. So this is the current stages. And I think in Taiwan, the people in Taiwan, they also anticipated that due to the geopolitical realities that the United States and Japan and probably the Quad probably will be when the security issue in Taiwan across the strait that started to have some issues. It will be the US, it will be the Quad, it will be the Japan that probably will be the country most likely to respond. And only very few people will expect that the EU will come in as a security forces in the scenarios. So basically, when we talk about the EU in a cross-strait relationship, it's basically anticipation of the Taiwan-EU relation and or how the EU could play a certain non-security role in help the balance for the cross-strait relations. And I have to say that with anticipation of those, the records on the EU on Taiwan probably does not show that much. Although a lot of people they talk about the some of the economic progress, whether the process for the bilateral trade, bilateral investment agreements that is still in process, and also the recent investment in Taiwan through some individual European member states, such as the Denmark or the Holland, on the wind turbine that has been one of the biggest enterprise investment in Taiwan in the recent years, such as those. Of course, those are the bright spot. But in terms of the whole advancement, it just does not seem to be there. So this is just to echo what the Ambassador Mike Riley has said earlier, that there are a lot of room that could go forward, but we do not see that is really going in a full force. And I would say that of course, Teresa earlier said, talk about the EU and the United States. They're starting to have some converging view about China. From the whether that's a partner, that's a competitor, and especially the description about the systemic rivals. Yes, right now we do see the trend about the development and coming to converging perceptions between the United States and the EU itself or the EU member states regarding what the what China should be. But we do not see the similar an attitude about Taiwan. So, or to a certain extent, that it does not seem to us that there's a EU Taiwan policy. And so basically it's individual member states, their own responses to a certain scenarios. Or when China has something on Taiwan, that it will just left to the EU member states individually for them to respond. This is what we saw as the situation developed right now. And even with those, about like some of the episodes in year 2018, such as Chinese pressure international companies regarding the how they should describe Taiwan or how they should designate Taiwan, and other the diplomatic allies competitions vis-a-vis Taiwan. The United States did come out, whether in the verbal support or even with certain actions in year 2019 to help Taiwan to stabilize its diplomatic allies. But EU itself or the EU member state hasn't really come up with any statement, let alone any actions on those. So this is one of the area I think that when we compare the United States and the EU, even in a non-security area, that the differences between them to the general public in Taiwan, that is very significant. And add to another interesting dimension in Taiwan, when the people talk about EU or some of the EU positive praise on Taiwan, they come up with an issue like the same-sex marriage, the legalization of same-sex marriage, and also in the past that the Taiwan's continue practices of capital punishment continue to be the problem between Taiwan and EU. So those are the issues not about China, but on the universal value or at least political values. But that become rather than an advancement, but also become some of the issue that started to become the probably future problem in Taiwan and the EU. And the reason I said that is that it started to get people in Taiwan to compare about the EU's attitude toward Chinese pressure on Taiwan and the Chinese human rights records versus vis-a-vis the EU when Taiwan is under the threat. So they will compare those two issues about the attitude from the EU on the capital punishment exercised by Taiwan and the rather silent action or the wording regarding the Chinese the political campaign against Taiwan. So this is just the general public, some of the perception that started to simmer around the corners that I observed so far. And I think about the advancement on the EU and the United States about the cross relationship, especially on the Taiwan, I think there are areas that actually we can work on. First of all, it's about the how to improve the democratic governance, how to put Taiwan itself as part of the, when we talk about the global democratic governance problem and issues, that Taiwan can contribute and Taiwan could participate. And this is the area that also matter very important in terms of Taiwan domestic and political reform. And as we started to move into the area with a lot of deep water and some of the reform that really touch on the nerve about the historical legacy in Taiwan itself, such as judicial reform, such as the transitional justice, many of those issues that the Taiwan not only is in need of help, but also our experience could be a very important experience sharing with the other country, including European Union member states, regarding the democratic governance. Another issue is that how Taiwan could, through the EU and the United States, common position and assistance to place Taiwan in a map of the global governance, especially with the pandemic, coronavirus demonstrates so far that we found out that the Taiwan itself could be a valuable contributors we are not the one that are requesting help, but that we can also be helpful to others. And Taiwan is willing to help. And I think it is important to how to consider when we have the global discussion about the global governance, that Taiwan could feature in those discussions, where the Taiwan's experience or Taiwan's shortfalls and even our advantage could be incomparable with others in the same stage, so that we could then actually participate and contribute. Now, the third thing is that when we talk about the value issues, I think in the competition or the issue caused by China regarding the global governance models, the pandemic issue in Taiwan, what demonstrated is that Taiwan is providing a counter argument against Chinese assertion that the Chinese authoritarian model is the best one that could respond to the pandemic problems. Because Taiwan is a democracy, and we are actually the way that we are doing this is try to maximize the democratic governance, but of course with a certain development of the technology and our citizens' conformity with the norm, and also the importance of how to build the trust of the governments. That is also important. And this probably will provide for both the democratic system as well as the global narrative campaign against the authoritarian narratives. That could also serve a good tool for that. In terms of the democratic governance, and that is the improvement with the technology and the kind of the trust issue that should be there and feature in a discussion when we talk about individual rights. That is part of the for some democratic system that they probably feature that is some of the problem that holding back against the government's battle against this pandemic. So I think the Taiwan particular cases could be a very important lessons that can contribute. And for Chinese, I think the Taiwan being not only in proximity in China, but also we are sharing a good deal with the Chinese culture that we're able to do through the democratic governance to respond to the pandemic in comparison with Chinese authoritarian model. That not only is a very good rebuttal, but also can demonstrate the kind of problem within the authoritarian and what kind of alternative that could coming out of the so-called the Chinese civilization in a different political system that could come out, a different political trust that could come out with this to respond to the Chinese authoritarian narrative campaign. So I think the EU and the United States, that about the cross-strait issue, some of the feature that Taiwan could actually be in has been rather underutilized. How the EU and the US, when they look at the cross-strait issues through some of the so-called non-security, but nonetheless, it's also very important in terms of norm-forming issues. That is another important area that we could feature the cooperation between the EU, United States, and Taiwan. So I just stop here. Thank you very much.
Izong, thank you very much for that. I thought very interesting discussion there. I think I was particularly struck and found it, interesting, revealing of the nature of Taiwan and EU relations when, you pointed out that, the pressing issues that are being discussed in such dialogues between the two sides center on issues like capital punishment and, other issues of same-sex marriage. It sort of highlights the nature of that relationship, when in fact, obviously there are these other also a number of hosts of other issues that could be and should be, not to make any light of those other issues which are important, but especially on the security front and non-traditional security front, challenging the sort of the issues of democratic governance, and I think that's an area where there is a great deal of opportunity for the United States, Taiwan, and Europe to be working more closely together, and I find myself to be sort of the unofficial promoter cheerleader for the global cooperation and training framework. But I do believe that that is a very useful mechanism that started back in 2015 between the United States and Taiwan, where the two sides were able to host dialogues inviting partners from across the region in a workshop forum to really help build capacity of partner countries in areas where Taiwan excels in areas of human rights, women empowerment, of energy, of health, public health. A lot of these workshops were centered on public health, and more recently focused on issues of democratic governance. And in particular, to note is the on media literacy. And there's been 2 such forums that have been held now in the past 2 years on media literacy. And I would just add that Sweden was one of the coordinating partners for the media literacy forum held last September. And it just and Japan has joined as a coordinating partner, an institutional coordinating partner for this dialogue. And I don't see why couldn't a European country join perhaps as a coordinating partner of an institutional coordinating partner in such a dialogue that could really I think help to elevate really the asset and capabilities that we all know Taiwan can bring to bear in a host of international issues, but is prevented from doing so because of China's political clout. And so I would just point out that I think it's I think you raised a lot of good suggestions there, and I think hopefully we can pick up on some of that either in the discussion or follow on in the in follow-up dialogues on this topic. But we have Teresa back now, so I do want to give her an opportunity to finish her remarks. So back to you, Teresa.
All right, thank you. We have heavy rain here in Brussels today that sometimes creates problems for the internet. I'm very sorry about that, and I'm very sorry to not have heard what the original speaker's comments. I hope I'm not duplicating any of their remarks. So I'll keep it short and sharp now. The 3 areas I want to emphasize now on EU-China relations and the strategic triangle with the US. So Beijing's strategic statecraft in Europe, the effective neutralization of Europe, and the variable geometry that we can use as a transatlantic approach. So under Beijing in 2008, there was kind of a sale of the century. They increased their investments dramatically in Europe, and that also not only in companies, but also in strategic infrastructure. And so we saw increased political influence. And so at least Europe is now more aware of that. So this economic statecraft is very useful because in an organization of now 27 member states, all you need is one country to say no when you need unanimity. So it was quite interesting what we saw yesterday at the Foreign Affairs Council that was held. Of course, the usual suspects were Greece and Hungary, who were watering down and preventing any sort of action by the EU in regard to the national security law in Hong Kong. And there is a lot of talk, and people recognize that. And I mean, I watched another webinar recently, and the head of the EU delegation in Hong Kong was a bit cranky about feeling that the EU was always being criticized. But dialogue, and 1 week ago they had another Foreign Affairs Council meeting, and out of the 27 EU member states, only 1 country, Sweden, put possible sanctions on the table. All other 26 did not. So this is kind of a barometer of expectations in Europe. They know the post-COVID-19 economic landscape will be difficult. They do not want to alienate China. And so Sweden has a very different economic relationship with China. So in one respect, they could possibly afford not to worry about how China treats them. And so we find this kind of perception that China is the future for them, that it's the economic future. It might be, we've already reached peak China, some economists would say, but there is definitely a perception on that. And the way the US is handling the COVID-19 pandemic also reinforces this idea that the US will be hobbled, that their economy will be hobbled, and that Europe perceives that there will be growth in China, and so the future will be in China. For example, we saw not one, but 2 planes full of German business people going to China to make deals. And this is part of what I wanted to talk about, the fragmentation narrative. China has realized that the most important country for them in Europe for their strategy is Germany. So they have kind of a special relationship with Germany. Germany clearly is the largest trade partner with China, and high technology equipment and mechanical equipment is part of their trade. So the fact that China deliberately cultivates Germany, so most EU policy really goes through Berlin first rather than through Brussels. So this was a clever approach by Beijing to cultivate good relations with Germany, and that helps set the economic agenda. I'm just going to give you a quick readout of the countries that support it. So we only saw out of 27 EU member states, only 15 voiced criticism of the new security law in Hong Kong. And some people think, oh, there's a north-south divide or east-west divide. It's all over the board. So it's not easy to say which countries would go into the China basket and which ones won't. And others change and move around, for example, Italy. So we see that Italy has rejected Huawei, and they also signed on for the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's very complex, and it's difficult for China to manage. In addition to this kind of economic statecraft, we saw the introduction of the 16+1, now known as the 17+1 sub-regional grouping that China has carved out of Central and Eastern Europe. And some of these member states in Central and Eastern Europe, so it's 11 EU member states, 5 possible accession states, and it's in a very strategic area. So Mackinder, the great geostrategist, would say that he who controls Central and Eastern Europe controls the world island. So they've been studying the Mackinder, and they really have a lot of influence in that region. There is promise fatigue. Some countries expected much more from China, but in reality, China doesn't need to spend a lot of money to get the influence that they want. So, for example, Hungary, India is a bigger investor in Hungary than China, yet Hungary will always kind of do China's bidding in regard to policy or to stop policies that Beijing does not like. And we just saw this happen yesterday. So Greece also has Piraeus Port, which Beijing Chinese companies have invested in. They've modernized it. It's actually quite productive and highly efficient port. So now they have a land-sea corridor from the Mediterranean all the way up to the Baltic. So no one really saw that when it was done incrementally, but this has really been an incredible move, I would say, by Beijing. So we have this kind of economic statecraft that's been extremely useful for China. And this also creates a neutralization of Europe. So we saw yesterday was the anniversary of the arbitral tribunal decision. And if we recall what happened 4 years ago, there were 3 member states, Croatia, Hungary, and Greece, who watered down the statement. So instead of welcoming the arbitral tribunal decision or supporting it, they just really acknowledged it. So that's, in diplomatic speak, that's the lowest possible thing. So in my analysis, Europe has been effectively neutralized since 2016. And I should add that Croatia had a maritime dispute with Slovenia, and so that's why they didn't want to be part of the decision. But Hungary and Greece, and the more countries that China can pull into their orbit, it's easier for them. No member state likes to be alone and they feel all the pressure. So the more countries that China can pull into their orbit, it is easier then for them to say no. So, so this effective neutralization of Europe, we saw that 4 years ago, and it continues. We've seen human rights statements blocked by Hungary. We've seen the statement on the lawyers that were imprisoned. The EU is unable to do that because of Greece. So we see really the things that the EU says that they value, human rights, so that they have this voice in the world. For the last 4 years, they've been effectively neutralized. So to conclude, so the work on the FTA, the hope, the dream of the EU having some sort of an economic agreement seems to be falling by the wayside. I think after 7 years of China holding out the carrot to them, I think people are really disappointed and discouraged. And so, I had something here about positive and negative. So in transatlantic relations, we really are seeing a crisis here. And it's not, the previous speaker, what I did hear when he said that, he gave the great example of the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So it's not just with Donald Trump. We saw a huge running to join the AIIB, even though the US had lobbied against their allies not to join. And so it's not just with the Trump administration. There has been this tectonic shift in how Europe perceives China, and that this is the future. Maybe they're taking the US for granted, but anyway, there is a tectonic shift happening in relations. So we've seen the EU describe the US, they put the US in the same basket as Russia and China. So I've never in my lifetime seen transatlantic relations in such bad condition. So, so the US position is quite clear, and we've seen Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo had a meeting, virtual meeting with Borrell. The Europeans asked for another meeting. So this is what, the European External Action Service, as a bureaucratic institution, for them a success is having another meeting. We even saw under the Obama administration, they were trying to curtail the amount of meetings. If you look at how many China has, 70 meetings a year with the Europeans. So they really have a lot of dialogues. And the Americans almost feel that they don't want to get sucked into more meetings with them, but it's a good sign. I think that Pompeo reached out and accepted Borrell's suggestion of this structured dialogue. And yesterday in Paris, there was a meeting with Matt Pottinger and O'Brien in person. They wanted to do it in person rather than virtually because they felt they could do much more effectively in person. So it's interesting that the EU, this structure was not the EU, it was the big powers. So you have the UK no longer a member of the EU, France, Germany, and Italy. And I think that kind of variable geometry is much more effective than working through with the EU right now. And now we have the German EU presidency. So the third point I want to make, I did talk about the special relationship with Germany. And Germany has actually been quite disappointed because Angela Merkel, coming to the end of her very long reign as chancellor, had envisioned the Leipzig summit, that it would take place in September. Xi Jinping would come to Europe. All the EU member states would meet, and it would be this grand statement of EU-China getting along and the signature on this investment deal. But that has been postponed because of COVID-19. Also very bad optics, considering what's happening in Hong Kong. And I think that it was just a good excuse to say it was because of COVID-19, because it would really be bad timing. The next leader of Germany will really set the stage for the next phase of EU-China relations, because perhaps Merkel, who's been in power for so long, doesn't want to be shown to have made a mistake. I mean, when facts change, your position should change. So there's still this kind of very pro-China position. She was in Wuhan a year ago working on exchange. She wanted to see German industry work technologically with China. So there's this fear that Germany could be trapped if they don't extend economic relations with China and get on that kind of high-tech train together. So I would suggest that in transatlantic relations, there are three things that we can really work on. Is technology projects, especially in 5G and 6G. We've seen even with Nokia and Ericsson, a lot of those things are produced in China. So China can prevent those things to be exported. So this is an issue if a EU member state chooses one of those companies for their 5G and China won't allow them to export the equipment, then they're really in trouble. So I think we need to come up with a better and smarter strategy. And the challenges in the transatlantic relations, quickly, WTO, Paris Agreement, and the JCPOA. And of course, finally, burden sharing. Now, we're not even talking about burden sharing any longer. People are talking about burden transfer. And this is a big issue. Now with COVID-19, there won't be much of a budget to spend on defense. So the whole narrative of the US is that we have big problems in Asia Pacific. We need you to pick up your burden and spend and take care of your own region. And so I feel that Europe has been kind of sitting on the fence, as an earlier speaker had mentioned. They don't want to have to make a decision, but there really is clear need for Europe to pick up and not even burden share any longer, but burden transfer. The US needs Europe to really take care of their own neighborhood. So opportunities would be a coalition of democracies. We see IPAC, it's this group of parliaments from around the world connecting democracies. So I think this is a positive development. And in Brussels, there is very little debate within the think tank community. It's almost that this kind of feeling of it's going to happen. Just go along with it. China's the new great power, and economically, we have to just work with them. So there's this almost defeatist narrative, which I find extremely worrying. So I would suggest trying to, come up with better strategies. But we really have to counter this defeatist narrative that's very prevalent here in Belgium. And this idea of the dialogue of democracies, a coalition of democracies balancing China's influence. And Europe, there are certain things that Europe has learned. The US can say things to them and they might not hear them. But the current situation with wolf warrior diplomacy really, I think, showed Europe kind of the arrogance Beijing had towards them. We've seen, we've got a gun for my friends and a gun for my enemies and wine for my friends. We're criticizing the Chinese ambassador, said that the French were leaving their old people to die in nursing homes, and even kind of making threats in the UK about Huawei. If they didn't embrace Huawei, there would be a blackout. So I think Europe is coming to their own conclusions on China, and they had to learn that on their own. So hopefully they will wake up, and that transatlantic relations will not just be repaired with, for example, a new US president. I think Europe really, the ball is in Europe's court, and they have to decide where they are. I mean, they're kind of floating around in this, like, we want autonomy, we don't want to make any decisions, but they really have to make a concerted effort, and the US can no longer carry the burden in Europe. So whether Europe remains a transatlanticist or becomes post-American depends on Europe's leaders. So that's where the ball lies now. Thank you.
Wow, wonderful, Teresa. That's excellent. I think you made a lot of excellent points in there. The one that really sticks out is really, just as much as we need coherence and cohesion in the transatlantic relationship, perhaps European cohesion and avoiding the fragmentation that you've highlighted is also critical into ensuring that there is a more concerted counter to China's influence operations in Europe, and so maybe perhaps some of the policy recommendations that may what the United States could do or is to try to help encourage some more cohesion among Europeans with regards to their China policy towards China, and of course with Taiwan as well. Now, just a reminder for our live audience members that we will open for audience Q&A for the last, probably around 10 minutes of the session. I will pose a few questions right now to exercise the moderator's prerogative. But just as a reminder, you can submit your questions either using the chat function on YouTube or by submitting a question to contact@globaltaiwan.org. Now, I want to get into perhaps a rather somewhat sensitive topic here, but this has a lot to do with Taiwan, and I think we've touched on the broader sets of issues that do affect EU-Taiwan relations, but I think this really strikes at the heart of it, and I think we've highlighted to a good extent that individual European countries do have good ties with Taiwan, shared values, and there are a lot of sort of positives in the relationship. But as much as there has been a lack of action taken, there seems to also be little inclination on the part of European countries to press the boundaries of individual countries' one China policy. So what would it take for European countries to really examine its one China policy? And when I pose these questions, obviously this is there's not one set European one China policy, but I do want to pose this question to perhaps Michael Riley and then also Teresa on how you think different individual countries' one China policy have adapted or became has adapted in response to what we're seeing from China. I mean, I think in many ways in the United States, the U.S. one China policy has demonstrated its elasticity. In many ways, it has shown that there is a lot that can be done with Taiwan still, even under the rubric of a U.S. one China policy. And I just haven't seen that similar adaptation in the European context. And I wonder to what extent you see that there is, or maybe I'm missing something. So Over to you, Michael, or Teresa, whoever want to take it first. Michael, perhaps, if you want.
Okay, let me give it a try. I think, sort of digressing in a sense, but as a way of approaching the answer, one of the biggest problems that European countries face, and not just European countries, I think it's applicable to most of the world in their relations with China, is this fear of China among their own policymakers, among their own bureaucrats. There is this very strong assumption, which I've certainly come across among European Commission bureaucrats. I've come across it with my own former colleagues, that you can't do this because China won't like it. I've come across it in my current academic position, this sort of fear that there'll be a bad reaction from China. This, to me, has been a great success of Chinese diplomacy. Predates Xi Jinping. They've convinced the rest of the world that if they do something, China's going to react badly. And the first step for any country, and this includes Greece, Hungary, all the others, is, look, they've got to really have the courage of their convictions and be willing just to actually take moves. There's a recent book come out in Australia, I've forgotten the name of it, but it's by Clive Hamilton and a German colleague, but it's looking at the extent of Chinese influence. They make a very good point about the extent to which, and Bob may disagree with me because I think the US is different here, the extent to which so many diplomats based in Beijing, there's this conviction, if you like, in their capitals that only a diplomat who, quote, understands China can go there to represent the country. Well, by the time they go back as an ambassador, they've been thoroughly imbued by the thuggery of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, that their default position to head office is you can't do that because China won't like it. I've dealt with this. I mean, at a personal level, the UK lifted its visa requirements against Taiwan. I had 3 years of people in London saying, we can't do this, there would be a really bad reaction from China. I said, where's your evidence? Give us the evidence. When we actually did lift, there was no reaction. And once we did, actually the rest of the EU was very happy to follow suit for the same reason. They saw there wouldn't be a reaction. And we really just need people to be willing to do this. China, to be fair, has made its red lines very clear. So there's a lot more that European countries, other countries could do without actually, in their dealings with Taiwan, without actually going across those red lines. But we've got countries like Spain, which in many ways I think is worse than Greece or Hungary. We've had Spanish universities refusing to have Taiwanese fairs because some junior diplomat in the Spanish embassy in Madrid has phoned up and complained. But the university should just tell them to go away. This is, I think, the first step. Let's get over this sort of self-abasement in front of China. Now, moving on to what can they do in terms of the one China policies. I think part of the difficulty is that there isn't such thing as a one China policy. Every country's one China policy is a little bit different. And undoubtedly, some of them in Europe very explicitly recognize Taiwan as a province of China and therefore are more inclined to take a pro-Beijing line. But at the other extreme, I think Germany basically doesn't take a position on this. The UK's position, although it's not publicly stated, is very clear that the UK does not recognize Taiwan as part of China. But nonetheless, publicly, it's hard at times to see a difference between the UK position and other countries. The Netherlands tends to, I think, by and large, be one of the more proactive ones. They've had Chen Shui-bian when he was president, having stopovers in Amsterdam, for example. We've seen Copenhagen host a visit by Joseph Wu, the foreign minister. I think the real challenge is I think it's too much to expect the whole of the EU 27 to act in concert on this, but there are sufficient countries within the EU who are like-minded. So Denmark, Sweden, for example, Finland perhaps see things similarly, the Netherlands. if countries can at least do things in collaboration, it makes it very much harder for China then to try to pick them off. And that's what I think they should be doing, rather than sort of looking at the detail of their own one China policy. They should just be talking to neighbors and saying, let's do this together. We might see more progress then.
Teresa, do you want?
That was an excellent point. And, you know, if they could speak with one voice, can you imagine if you could get all 27 EU member states to speak with one voice? China would just have to accept the position. But instead, China has, you know, divide and rule, and China has each member state kind of like pick me for that investment over this project. So you're right. You know, this is the base. This is the nub of the problem. If they could finally just all agree to speak with one voice, there would be nothing China could do about it. But instead, everyone is jealous of investment or favor with China. So this is the problem. And your idea of this variable geometry, this is the problem, especially in foreign policy. It's not seen as an EU position then. So you're right, if some of them are strong and you know, work together. But even, for example, Norway, when it had awarded Liu Xiaobo the Nobel Peace Prize, it's not an EU member state, but it's also part of the FTA. But instead of kind of showing solidarity, the EU could have showed solidarity. For example, they've complained that, you know, Scotland took over the salmon exports to China that Norway once had. So there's really a lack of solidarity across the board when it's seen as economic opportunities in China. And I haven't seen a way around that. And I think it's becoming even sharper. It will be more sharp with the decline in people's economies post-COVID-19. So I think China has really made the calculus and decided we can be as rude as we want. No one's going to care, and they want our money, they want our investment. And I agree with you about the fear factor. We just had a recent example of the head of the EU delegation for the 45th anniversary of EU-China relations, you know, writing a rather anodyne, you know, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and all the 27 EU member state ambassadors had signed off on it. But there was one sentence that talked about the origin of COVID-19 being in Wuhan, and that we should all work together and improve World Health System. And it had to be removed. So instead of talking to the other EU member states, the head of the EU delegation just decided to self-censor this, and without even getting the permission from the EU member states, and signed off on it. And so instead of even, they thought that they would get it published in the People's Daily to a broad audience, but instead it was just published in English in the China Daily. So even though they self-censored, the head of the delegation didn't get anything out of that except a ticking off by the European Parliament, who wanted his resignation. So I understand now he's on a very tight leash, and this is what happens. It's kind of this capture of these diplomats. He had been to Beijing on several other diplomatic postings. He's a French diplomat, and now he's been parachuted in as a head of the EU delegation. So you do see this fear factor that I know China and I know this would upset them, so I will make the decision on behalf of everyone. And then let's remember, you know, China needs Europe as well as a market. And Europe has more leverage than they think, but they're always kind of fearful. And I really agree with your point that it's so difficult to get over this fear factor, and that people do self-censor, people behave in such a way as not to potentially upset China. So China doesn't really have to even make too many red lines, because member states will self-censor to prevent anything like the anaconda in the chandelier. So in that book that you were talking about, I understand it was like a mini earthquake in the UK, calling out the names of naming and shaming people who've been described as useful idiots of Beijing. I think it's a hidden hand. But we have seen closure of Confucius Institutes in many EU member states. So there is a backlash, and there is growing interest in somehow countering Beijing, but I'll leave it at that. Oh, and one final point, especially for Taiwan, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, there was a really interesting situation, because it's not just China with their mass diplomacy, and a lot of the equipment that they had exported was of very low quality. And then Taiwan had exported all these and gifted aid, masks, high quality masks to Europe, which were so greatly appreciated that Ursula von der Leyen wrote a tweet thanking Taiwan for this much needed help and how grateful they were. And of course, it's irritated Beijing greatly, but it's the first time we've ever seen, the president of the European Commission kind of thank Taiwan in that fashion. All right, it's not it was a tweet, but still, I think it was quite a good sign of Taipei's mask diplomacy. Thanks.
Now, I have plenty of questions I want to ask our panelists, but I do want to give our audience members an opportunity to have their questions presented, and we've received a few of those questions. And so I'm going to present these questions from our audience members. The first question is from Tina Chung from the Voice of America. Her question is, China's hardline approach to Hong Kong caused a lot of concerns about the future of Taiwan and possible conflict in the Taiwan Strait. With the PLA military activities getting more aggressive towards Taiwan, is there any message that European countries, other allies of the US, and like-minded countries can send to help ease tensions? So I open this up for the panel to answer. Anyone would like to take a first stab at that? Bob, perhaps? Make sure to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Not so much what the U.S. might do, but clearly, I think the U.S. is sort of stepping ahead. We saw more recently, for example, the sending of 2 aircraft carriers to the region. I think at least under this administration, with Pompeo and others, I think the U.S. will respond. I think more forcefully. What the next administration will do, I don't know. But I think generally it's shifting. The question now is whether the Europeans, Tina was asking, how the Europeans might respond to this.
So maybe turn it over to Michael again, if you'd like to.
Okay. Well, if I got the full question, it ended with what can they do to help ease tensions?
Right.
And I think the $64,000 bit of that is, well, would more security activity in the region by Europe ease tensions or inflame them further? Bearing in mind that Europe has not been involved in security in that part of the world really since the end of the Korean War, or certainly since the UK handed over Hong Kong. So, as I said, I mean, the UK and France are increasing their ship visits in the area, their freedom of navigation operations. It's modest. The EU has made statements about Hong Kong. Maybe they're seen as being insufficient, but nonetheless, I think there is a degree of European solidarity on that. The only way really that tensions are going to be eased is if China itself backs off. So the message from Europe has to be back off, rather than sort of going in there with a gun and threatening China, it seems to me. Now, is China going to heed that message? Well, only time will tell, I think. There's no short-term answer on it. But so far, what we've seen from Xi Jinping certainly is he's not inclined to wind down the tension. He seems to think he can go further.
Teresa, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, we have the numbers. So 15 at the UN Human Rights Council, so 15 EU member states supported it. 12 did not support it, including Bulgaria, Croatia, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Malta, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Spain. So there's 12 countries that did not support it. So the EU is deeply divided on this. So that's why we get these watered down. The only thing they came up with yesterday at the Foreign Affairs Committee is that they will promote scholarships so students can come here and study. So I think that the EU is fond of dialogue, but I think in the court of international opinion, which I think Beijing is concerned about, this type of figure where the EU is divided right down the middle almost, it's not sending a very strong message. I would have liked to have seen something far more strong, especially with other democracies in the region. Maybe that would have gotten Beijing's attention, but they cannot count on them. So the EU needs some diplomatic Viagra. They need a little more than what they have, and they really should punch more above their weight. But there is this fear, and no one wants to upset Beijing these days.
Thank you. I have a question from a colleague, and this is for Dr. Lai Zong. And I think Bob, maybe you can, or Mira, our European friends can add in their perceptions from Europe. But for Dr. Lai, do you feel that Taiwan's position in Europe has been strengthened by the pandemic? Has medical diplomacy been an effective tool for international engagement? For you?
Yeah, thank you. I think to a certain extent, it did raise the Taiwan's profile within the European member states and probably EU institution itself. And also it raised the popularity of Taiwan among the EU general populace. So yeah, in that regard, yes, it sort of raises a little bit profile, but how that translates into the real diplomatic actions, I think that still remains to be seen. We see some ups, such as just Teresa just mentioned earlier about the EU commissioners expressed public thank you to Taiwan, which we never seen that before, so that's the first time. But we also saw some of the EU member states, such as Germany, when they talk about the donation from Taiwan, they would not even utter the name of Taiwan in their public expression about appreciation. So yes, to the extent that I think there's an up and down. But I think I also like to add something that both Mike Riley and Teresa said earlier about the question to them. About the European member states, their engagement with Taiwan, some of them, and the action is actually better than the United States with Taiwan. Just if you just look at it in terms of the level of the officials' visit to Taiwan. For the United States, that any people around the rank, above the rank of the assistant secretary, that's considered to be a very big deal. But we saw already several EU member states, their vice minister or even ministerial levels visit Taiwan, even publicly. That has been going on for decades or even much longer. And just as Mike Riley said earlier, that not a lot of the strong reaction from China and some of the EU member states, such as formerly the UK, they have the vice minister come to Taiwan, and I think people probably remember during either 15 or 16, he visited the Taipei City Mayor Ko Wen-je at that time. So that also that was one of the visible ones. So I think when we talk about the so-called one China policy, definitely different countries within the EU member state, they have the different definitions, but a lot of them is actually how the practice define the one China policy. And the kind of the practices is the definition power is actually resides within the EU member state their own, and how to really utilize and realize that you have this as a leverage. And I think that's an important issue for our European friends to really appreciate.
That's excellent. Excellent point, Dr. Lai. I think sort of the practice and how the practice defines the type of the definition. And I think what Ambassador Riley was mentioning earlier was that fear has sort of have created this self-imposed restrictions that even the policy itself perhaps does not necessarily prescribe or prescribe. Michael, Teresa, do you have anything to add with regards to European perceptions of Taiwan's medical diplomacy? I know we basically already went over our time, but with our panelists' permission, I do want to give them a chance to make some concluding remarks and perhaps respond to this question. Anything to add, Mike or Teresa?
Well, not really. I mean, I would just endorse all that's been said. It has been positive for Taiwan, the medical diplomacy. The unfortunate reality for Taiwan is that essentially it's a small country of 23 million people next to 4 billion people. It's got to be able to be doing this sort of thing on a daily basis all the time just to keep on or just to get onto radar screens in European capitals. It doesn't have the same huge resources China does. So it's just a constant fight for it. But I would just say, don't be dissuaded, don't be discouraged. This has shown what Taiwan can achieve in terms of impact. Carry on doing things like it.
Thank you. Teresa?
I endorse everything he says. I'll just make a quick comment that it really showed that Taiwan was more like Europe than the PRC is, because after Beijing had sold a lot of this aid, they requested endorsement letters from these countries saying, thank you so much, you did such a great job. And Taiwan, of course, didn't do that. So I think the Europeans were, first of all, surprised at Beijing's efforts to get them to sign these letters. Whereas when Taiwan gifted this kind of very high quality aid, they were seen as more like Europe. So there seemed to be a commonality there, whereas, you know, this idea of like almost going back to school, I need a little letter of endorsement from Beijing saying how great, you know, thank you for the masks. Whereas Taiwan, everyone's like, those are the most valued masks in Brussels, for example. And I have to make a comment about the Czech Republic. So we see how complex relations are. We have Zeman, who's actually very pro-China, but then the mayor of Prague, there's a famous story of how, you know, like the ghost of Havel is there, and it's this kind of inspired support of democracy. And we see the Prague kind of uniting and becoming a sister city with Taipei. And so this is incredible. And so this shows how complex and multi-layered the relations across Europe are. But I think that the Prague mayor is actually quite an interesting story. That's a side segued away from medical diplomacy, but the mass diplomacy, I think people did appreciate it in Europe, and it did get recognized, and it normalized Taiwan. It made them seem more like Europeans. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Bob, any sort of final thoughts? And perhaps let me leave you with this question for you, Bob. And this is from a colleague. And I think this is really also a central point of our discussion today, which is focused on transatlantic approach. And Bob, so the question for you is, what sort of policies then should U.S. policymakers be pursuing to best support a transatlantic approach to cross-strait issues? With the last word, Bob. You the last word.
Okay, and before I answer that specifically, just very quickly, my own thinking about this is, there's a Chinese saying, an ancient Chinese saying, 多行不义必自毙. It means if you keep on doing bad things, at the end, you will destroy yourself. And it's an old Chinese saying. And I think it's a story of empires that overstretch and all that. At this point, clearly, China, which is that some people still find it in their interest and so on. But my bet is that China in its current regime will continue doing many things that eventually will impinge on the interests of Europe, of other countries, of the United States, of etc. And at some point, the interests that are impinged will be so wide and so strong that there will be a stronger backlash. At this point, I think countries are still undecided how to respond. But I think down the line, unfortunately, I think China will continue to expand given its China dream and so on. At some point down the line, I think it's already becoming clear, but at some point down the line, it will become very clear, hopefully not too late for a response to that. As for the US, I think in response to the question, I think this administration, following administrations, our think tanks and others have, I think, have begun to really recognize what China's threat and potential threat could be, and how serious it is to continue to respond on our own. And I think Michael is right. At the end of the day, in Asia, with Taiwan and China, U.S. initiative will be key. U.S. leadership will be key. And I think that I see that there's been a really tectonic shift in terms of how we view China and its threat to the liberal international order and our interests as well. And so I think we need to make sure that people are aware that we go to Europe, as O'Brien and Matt Pottinger, and in the future others will do, to try to carry this message and increase awareness, and then of course try to coordinate action in different areas.
Well, Thank you very much, Bob. And obviously, given the importance and the complexity of the issues that we are tackling today, we could really go on for hours, if not days. Really tackling, addressing all these issues. But we have exhausted all the time that we have, and I do apologize to audience members whose questions I have not been able to get to. Please, go on. The video will be available online, and I hope that you will join us again for our next event. So. Thanks you to all our presenters very much for your thoughtful your comments and insights. This will certainly not be the last of these types of dialogues that we will host by the Global Taiwan Institute. And we look forward to you joining our next event. Thank you all. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you.